The Renaissance is often described as a transitory period in which much of Europe moved from the Middle Ages to the modern period. Mention of the Renaissance evokes thoughts of beautiful works of art, sculpture, and architecture by individuals such as Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, and many others. Although derived from the French word meaning rebirth, the Renaissance actually began in 14th century Italy, more specifically Florence, Italy. You see, after the Middle Ages, the city of Florence had become a prosperous republic through its extensive trade networks with Asia and East Europe. Much of this trade was of Florentine wool, which was known to be of superior quality to those from other parts of Europe. Wealthy Florentines included merchants and bankers, most notably the Medici family, who had made their fortune lending money at high interest. Even though lending at this rate was illegal at the time, they were able to circumnavigate this by using foreign currency exchange, lending in one currency and collecting debt in another and taking a commission in the process. Families like the Medici were cultural patrons, funding prominent pieces of art that exist still today. From Florence, the Renaissance spread throughout Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries. The rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman culture inspired approaches to the arts and new ways of thinking. One of the prevalent philosophies of the time was humanism, an intellectual movement characterized by the influence of classical texts to inform a more human-centered view of the world. And by classical, I mean classical Greek and Roman. The writings of three individuals, Dante, Petrarch, and Giovanni Boccaccio, from the late medieval period were instrumental in the development of the humanist movement. And although they were Christian, these writers defended secular learning and thinking, arguing against the detractors of secular thinking and blending classical and Christian values. As well as writing books with many classical elements in Italian vernacular instead of the usual Latin, they also rediscovered classical manuscripts which had been lost. They were also critical of the corruption they saw within the church. For example, in Dante's The Divine Comedy, he takes aim at members of the Catholic clergy for their greed, corruption, and abuse of power, and argues for a separation of the church and state. And remember, all of this is taking place against the backdrop of a Europe that's been decimated by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, in a time when many were beginning to question their religious beliefs. In Northern Europe, humanist views were also being developed in the Northern Renaissance, and was beginning to influence theology and theologians. One of these theologians was Dutch humanist Erasmus, whose mastery of Greek allowed him to interpret, translate, and edit many Greek classics and the Bible using the original text. In 1516, he published his first Greek edition of the New Testament. His appreciation for original texts and his approach to Christianity would pave the way for other theologians, including reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin. The Reformation, or fully as it's known, the Protestant Reformation, was a movement which resulted in the split of the Church into the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. It started in 1517, when Martin Luther challenged the role of the Catholic Church and its corrupt practices, most notably the buying of indulgence, in a document called the 95 Theses. Improvements in the printing press allowed for the dissemination of the Theses and the Bible, allowing individual believers to be less dependent on the Catholic Church and its clergymen, and allow them to take personal responsibility for their relationship with God. The English Renaissance itself saw the first English edition of the Bible translated from the original Hebrew and Greek texts and the works of a man of the name William Shakespeare. Never heard of him. One of the most notable things about the Renaissance period was the creation of timeless pieces of art. Motivated by a need to honor God, wealthy individuals and the church commissioned paintings and sculptures such as the Last Supper, David, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the Sistine Madonna, and many others that would come to be identified with the Renaissance. Although they often had classical themes, Catholic narratives dominated the works of art. Renaissance architecture also emerges. Drawing inspiration from ancient Greek and Roman architectural style, its features emphasize symmetry and proportion, depicting classical hallmarks such as columns and rounded arches. This was in contrast to the pointed arches and stained glass windows you would see in the preceding Gothic architecture. Humanist thinking, which promoted the idea of the potential of the individual, also shaped the field of science. There was a newfound emphasis on scientific rationalism and reasoning, and the desire to have a better understanding of the world around them. The Polish astronomer and mathematician Copernicus proposed a model of the universe that placed the sun at its center. A new approach to science called empiricism would also come to the forefront. Scientists will now hypothesize, make predictions based on their hypotheses, and carry out experiments to test their predictions. This was all done to investigate the world through experience and experiment, instead of the usual rationalism or religion for that matter. One of such scientists was Galileo, who pioneered the use of instruments such as the thermoscope and the telescope in observing the world. Another was Leonardo da Vinci, who as well as being a painter, studied anatomy and practiced as an engineer and architect, a true Renaissance man. The Renaissance period also saw great leaps in the field of navigation, taking advantage of the improvements in shipbuilding that had taken place in the Middle Ages, and with the looming threats of a more powerful Ottoman Empire, European countries were looking for more ways of profiting from trade and hoping to spread the Christian faith. The Italian explorer, Christopher Columbus, was sponsored by the Spanish monarchy. He was looking for a faster, more direct route to Asia, and so he set sail west, rather than the usual east. And in 1492, he landed on the Caribbean island, convinced he was in East Asia. In the following centuries, explorers from France, Portugal, Netherlands and England will follow, establishing settlements in the New World. At the start of this video, I described the Renaissance as a transitory period, but it's also helpful to describe it as a cultural movement, building on a rediscovery of Greek and Roman cultures. Remember, the arbitrary boundaries we use in periodizations are often subjective, and they don't necessarily reflect the complexities of the movements that take place across these periods. After all, the people living in the time would not have described their lifetime as the Renaissance. The cultural shifts of the Renaissance, as depicted in the art of Michelangelo, the beliefs of Martin Luther, and the politics of Machiavelli, will serve as a foundation for the birth of the Age of Enlightenment. Cool.